So we've all been told that Babylon, the city of Babylon and the Tower of Babel and those stories from the Bible, from Genesis, we've been told that the Tower of Babel belongs in Mesopotamia, sort of where, the Iran-Iraq war area in the Mesopotamia over there in the Middle East. We've been told that that's where Babylon and Babel, the Tower of Babel, were to be found, somewhere they call it modern-day Iraq today. But what if those assumptions really deserve a second look? And I think they do, but let's take a look at that. What if some of the clues, we're talking biblical, historical, and even from maps, from cartographic evidence, point us somewhere different entirely? So what if this place that we've taken for granted, Mesopotamia, because that's what we've always been told, that this is where Babylon and Babel, the Tower of Babel, actually were? But what if that's incorrect? And I think for this video, I want us to consider, and of course I'm not putting this out there as I know this for a fact at all, right? I'm putting this out there, not trying to prove 100% exact this is where the Tower of Babel was, or the Babylon, or what have you. But could it have also been in Africa? Is there a possibility even that we've looked at the wrong place for Babylon, and the ruins we're looking at in Iraq are not the actual Babylon or Babel of the Bible, but that they are possibly in Africa? And like I said, we're going to look at maps. I want to look at the Book of Jubilees, which is not anymore part of the Bible, but it was, and it is an extra-canonical or apocryphal work of the Bible, and there's some really interesting things in there to help us understand more about Babel and Babylon. So we're just going to look at some pieces, some different ideas, some pieces that come up, and ask ourselves if these things actually add up for Mesopotamia, as we're told, or is there some other place, possibly in Africa or elsewhere, that might match better the biblical account? So like I said, the traditional view, if you were to go look on Google or anywhere else, start to look it up, you'll find that they will tell you that Babel, or the Tower of Babel, or Babylon, later Babylon, is in Mesopotamia, in the land of Shinar, because that is what it says in the Bible, the land of Shinar, okay, or Shinar, in Mesopotamia. It doesn't say Mesopotamia, okay, in the Bible. It doesn't. It just says, it talks of Babel, and it talks of Babylon, and it talks of the land of Shinar. So the traditional view is based on long-standing interpretations of the book of Genesis. We're not talking 4,000-year interpretations. We're talking since Rome and onwards, okay? Later historical associations and assumptions. And that's what I want to look at today. And just make you think, if nothing else, just to make us think and consider, are we really sure about some of the things that we know? My channel is called Fleeing Babylon, and what I want to do is have us think. Doesn't mean I'm right or wrong, or there's many other people putting out great things about lots of interesting things where we may have been told lies in our lives, or our fathers have taught us lies all our lives. Doesn't mean that this is a lie or not, but I want to go through at least some of the things so we can think about, are we sure we know where some of these things are located? So at the same time, we know for sure that early civilization did not exist in just one place. We know from it was in the Americas, we know in China, we know, and even in Europe to some degree, but they weren't very advanced in Europe for 3,000 years ago. They were definitely not advanced. But like in China, Africa for sure, in Egypt and in Nubia, where Meroe is today, in Ethiopia, these are where some of the earliest civilizations, and also including Iran and Iraq in that area as well. There were not just one place in the world that had civilization. There were different civilizations where men created different civilizations. But in terms of specifying which one is which by name, a lot of those names were put on places much later. I've already done a video on Jerusalem and Jericho and Sinai and a lot of these things that we just assume are where they are, but that go over the fact that Helena of Rome in 325 after Christ went to the Holy Land, what we call the Holy Land today, and she said, this is here, and this is there, and this is Nazareth, this is, and she made up, and afterwards, people after her as well, have made up assumptions about where places were. Even the name Egypt was not the name of Egypt 3,000 years ago. It was Kemet, okay? And before that it was Mizraim, and it was part of Nubia. There were different names, but what we have now, we just assume that that is what it is, always has been. So regions like Egypt and Nubia, as I explained, were already highly developed. When Europeans were still living in mud huts, okay, there was already tremendous civilizations in Africa and in the Middle East. A key figure when we're discussing Babel, or Babel, when we're discussing this from Genesis, is Nimrod. Nimrod was the son of Cush, and Cush was the son of Ham, and Ham was the son of Noah, as we know. So Nimrod was the grandson of Ham. So he was a Hamite, but he was also a Cushite. And it's very important that we think about this, because who did Moses marry? He married a woman that was a Cushite. Okay, and we already, most people accept where Cush was, which was down just south and to the east of Egypt. So where Nubia, where Sudan is today, Ethiopia, down in that area, is where Cush would have been found, the lands that were given to Cush. And we remember, and this is why Jubilees is important, Jubilees and the Genesis say how the land was divided, but Jubilees is much more in depth about this and why Canaan was cursed. It doesn't say why Canaan, the son of Ham, was cursed and Ham was not. It just says that Canaan was cursed. It didn't say that all of Ham's kids were cursed, like Mizraim and Cush and Put. Just Canaan is mentioned as being cursed, and there's Jubilees gives a reason for that, which is why we'll talk about that in a minute. So we need to discuss, for this discussion, we really need to focus in on Nimrod and Cush. We have to understand that, and Jubilees, as I said, will help us to understand how the land was divided much better. If Nimrod, who was a son of Cush, which is the case, then his origin, the origin of Nimrod, points to where he lived. So if he was a Cushite, he lived in Cush's land. If he was the son of Cush, Nimrod, then his kingdom, where he lived, was within Cushite lands. Unless we read somewhere that he went out a conquering outside of Cushite lands, but it doesn't say that. And Jubilees is actually quite specific that they were to stay, they would be cursed if they left the lands that were given to the nation. So Cush and the Cushites were given a geographic piece of land which was theirs, which they could expand and multiply within that land. And Put was given the Libya area, northern Africa, and Mizraim was given what we call Egypt today to expand into. Shem and Japheth, as well as Ham, were all given their areas in the world. I think that's confused. We'll go into that in another video. But for this video, I want to talk about Cush, and specifically Nimrod, because where he lived geographically is very important. If we can find Cushite lands, then we can find possibly or probably where Nimrod lived. It only makes sense. Nimrod is described in the Bible as a mighty hunter. And that in and of itself raises a very interesting question, at least for me. What kind of environment best fits that description? A mighty hunter. A mighty hunter needs mighty game. He has to go after, he's killing animals. But he was described as a great hunter or a mighty hunter. But if we look at the Levant or north of Egypt today into the Middle East, what would Nimrod, if he was in Mesopotamia, what was he hunting? You know, we're talking, this is desert landscape, except for the rivers, what we call the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia. But if he was a mighty hunter, we have to think about what was he hunting. So what kind of environment best describes Nimrod's action as a mighty hunter? Because hunting, of course, happened in all regions of the world. But the scale and the imagery of the game, and even the animals that are named in the Bible. And I've done a video on this, the animals of the Bible, the lions and the leopards and the apes and the crocodiles and the elephants and the mammoth beasts and the the hyenas and the jackals. The animals that are mentioned in the Bible tend to fit a certain geographical area of the world. And if you want to watch that video, I'll leave a link. But while hunting certainly, like I said, existed across many regions, the scale and the imagery of large game, when we think of large game and mighty hunters, even of the 18th century or 19th century, were lions, elephants, rhinoceros, hippos, I suppose, large animals, large animals. We don't see even in our day, if you see, go look at pictures of hunters with their kills. If it's in America, it's going to be either with a mountain lion or a bear or an elk or a moose. That tend to be the pictures. You don't see many of them taking pictures of themselves with a pronghorn antelope or with a rodent or a beaver or some small animal. Hunters take pictures, prize pictures, and hang them on horns on their walls of large animals. And if we look at Africa today, it is one of probably the prime area of large animals. Yes, there are elephants in India, and they were hunted as well, and tigers. But where are the main hunting areas for great hunters in the world has always been Africa, because of the great animals there and the quantity of them. Now, does that prove that Nimrod was in Africa? No, but it's just something I want us to think about as we go through this. The imagery of a great hunter, just think about that one. The next thing I want to just touch on here, and this is, I think, where it gets a little bit more interesting, maybe. I hope this is interesting anyway. Some older maps, we're talking 400, 500, 300-year-old maps of Africa, have places like Shinar on the map in Africa, south of Egypt. Places called like Meroe, which we know, and I'll show some images of that. Meroe has tons of pyramids and temples. It's not even been excavated properly. Nothing south of Egypt has really had much in the way of excavation, even though there's great ruins as great as there are in Egypt. It's been pushed down because of colonial, we'll just say, desire to not show Africa as being important. But Meroe, which was known to be part of the kingdom of Cush, a Cushite great city, where the Nile splits into two rivers and comes back together again and makes an island. And there's Meroe. And we can see there in these old maps, we can see Babylon right there, named Babylon. We can also see Babel, and we can see the strait, I think today it's called Bab el-Mandab or something like that, where the Red Sea goes into a very narrow bit of land where there's been war going on in Yemen in that area. But where that narrow strip of land, that strait has part of its name being Babel or Babel. So we have to go, okay, there's another little clue, okay? But the fact that we have on the maps 300, 400 years, 500 years ago, places right by Meroe, part of Cush, the land of Cush, near Sudan, Ethiopia, where we have today, on the lower Nile, or south of Egypt. And we have this, as part of the kingdom of Cush, we see the names Shinar, we see the names Babylon, and we see the name Babel. And you have to go, okay, does that prove anything? No, because names on maps, we can't guarantee just because the name was there 300 or 400 years ago that is the name of that place. It's like the river that we call the Euphrates River today. It's up in Iraq. Do we know that the Euphrates River was called that 4,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago? No, not at all. Okay, not at all. Names change, absolutely. Names change all the time. Like I said, when Helena of Rome went and made the Holy Land and said this is this and this is that, this is Jerusalem and this is the Sea of Galilee and this is Mount Sinai and this is this and Jericho, and like I've done in another video, the walls of Jericho never came down at the time of the Exodus. There were no walls there. So there was no, that creates a problem, right? Creates a problem, right? It's the same as Sinai, when they can't find any sign of human, millions, a million people going through and living the Sinai for 40 years, and there's no remnant of anything in the Sinai because it's a dry wasteland without water, then that makes a problem. So Helena named that Mount Sinai, and she named this river the Jordan River or whatever. Those things were not always named in maps. There's no maps from 3,000 or 4,000 years ago that show that the Euphrates was here, and or even that the Nile was even called the Nile then, right? So there's names that are in the Bible, even in the U.S. or Canada. There's lots of place names that are named after places that are in Europe or named from the Bible. So place names can change. But I only bring up this about the older maps because they do have Babylon being south of Egypt. I just did a video. I think it's an important video, but it's my opinion anyway. I made a video on that of Moses going into North Africa and spending 40 years in where the Sahara is now on grasslands from that time, and then going down into probably Uganda or Kenya. And one of the issues with that premise, which of course flies in the face of what we believe, but one of the issues with that premise is then how did Babylon, if Babylon was actually up in Mesopotamia, north of Egypt, how did Babylon attack the Israelites? Or how did Babylon attack Judah and capture it and take it prisoner if Babylon didn't conquer Egypt? Because they would have had to come from Mesopotamia to get, if Israel, the land of the 12 tribes, was really in Africa, then the only way to get there from Mesopotamia would be to conquer Egypt or go through it. But we don't read of that anywhere. That didn't happen, which makes that's what brought me to think, well then Babylon, where is it then? If it can't be in Mesopotamia, if Africa is actually where the Bible was written, then that would mean that Babylon would have to be there. That would mean some of the things that we assume now may not be accurate. And then when you go and look at these maps and you see, oh look, there's Babylon. Oh look, there's Babel. There's a strait with Babel in the name, right where Babylon and Cushite lands were. And then we see on the map Shinar, a land of Shinar. Now, does this prove anything? Like I said, it doesn't prove things. But at least it makes us think of possibilities. And in my opinion, it makes me ask why. Why did this happen? How is it possible? Is this possible? The key thing I want to get into now, I think it's very important, is the Book of Jubilees. Whether we accept it as canonical or non-canonical, it is an ancient book. And it has some important things that have to do with this issue. I did a video on why Canaan was cursed, because you can find that from the Book of Jubilees. It doesn't say in the Bible why. People assume it was because something to do with Noah, but it wasn't, because Noah was naked. Canaan didn't come into the tent. Canaan was a son of Ham. So what happened there? That's a whole other matter. But why was Canaan cursed and Cush and Mizraim and Put, they weren't cursed? Then we go, okay, then Jubilees speaks to this, that Canaan stole the land of Shem, and his brothers, Cush and Put and Mizraim, pled with Canaan not to do it, not to go out of his inherited land and steal someone else's and bring a curse upon himself and his family forever. And Canaan said, I don't care, I'm taking the land, and that the curse didn't matter to him. But like I said, the Book of Jubilees explains this very well. So this text explains how the earth was divided among the sons of Noah and their families, and where the boundaries were assigned, and not only where they were assigned, that these boundaries were sacrosanct, given by God. They were sacrosanct. They were not to go out beyond their boundaries without getting cursed for doing so. So Cush was assigned a region, it's fairly well accepted that this region was just south of Egypt, because Mizraim got the land of Egypt, what we call Egypt, okay, today, or Kemet. Now were there wars between Cush and Kemet? Yes, there were, right? And Put got North Africa. That's fairly well considered that where Libya was. But back in those days, there were lakes there. There were grasslands. It wasn't the Sahara Desert like we have today. But the key question is, if Cush was given the Horn of Africa, or it's where we have Sudan, Ethiopia, and that area today, if that was Cushite land, then how did Nimrod, the son of Cush, how did he break or get the land? Why wasn't he cursed? If he went all the way up into Mesopotamia, which was not the land of Cush, then we're talking thousands of miles. I mean, we're talking a long way. I'll show that on the map. But if he went there, and then that became, and made Babel and Babylon there, that means he immediately, as soon as land was given to Cush, he disobeyed his father and Noah, and would have gotten cursed like Canaan got cursed. But we don't read of Nimrod being cursed for that reason. Was Nimrod righteous? No, he was not righteous. But we don't read of him going outside the boundaries of Cushite land. Which brings up the question, or at least my feeling, that Nimrod would have lived and made Babel within his own land, within the Cushite territories. And Africa is huge, so the Cushite lands were huge, and the family was just small at the time after the flood. So there was lots of room to expand. They didn't need to go into other people's lands to expand. There was tons of room for expansion within the land that was allotted to each of the sons of Noah and to their grandsons and their family. So if we think about this geographically for a minute, if Nimrod began in a region associated with Cush, which I just went over, south of Egypt, then to reach Mesopotamia, he would have either had to go by ship across into what we call Saudi Arabia today, or he would have had to go conquering through Egypt into Mizraim's territory, up through Egypt, up through what we call the Middle East today, and all the way up to Iraq. He would have had to go to war and through other people's lands to go up and take over Mesopotamia. That means he would have, as I said, he would have had to take other people's inherited lands, which means he would have been cursed. Because if Canaan was cursed for taking the land of Shem, then Nimrod would have been cursed if he had taken the lands of other peoples. So the question then becomes, would that kind of movement align with Jubilees? And in my opinion, it does not. It does not align. So then you have this, like two different issues, two different things you got to consider. We believe, and scholars believe, and we are told to believe, that the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, that area, that's where Babel and Babylon were. But if we also look at Jubilees and the Genesis account, then Cush was in a certain area. That's why Moses, when he was in Egypt and he fled, he married a Cushite woman, because Cush was the boundary of Cush and Mizraim. That's where Cush lived. So Moses met a Cushite woman and married her. And so when we see this, two things can't both be true. And I can't tell you the answer to this. I'm only presenting this so that we can start to consider, is possibly the Bible actually African? That's my opinion. It's just my opinion, that the Bible is completely African. And it all happened south of Egypt. I did a video on Abraham where it says that Abraham went up out of Egypt, up meaning up the Nile, up elevation, and he went south. Okay? Some people say he went into the Negev, but again, there was no name in the Negev desert. Where they call Negev today is not the Negev of old, but be that as it may, he went south, and Lot with him and Sarah, his wife. But they went back to the lands that they'd come from, in my opinion, which was in Africa. And in my opinion, Canaan stole the land of Uganda and Kenya and further south, and he wanted that good land, the Great Lakes area of Africa, and stole the land and was cursed for it. But again, that's just my opinion. But the problem, like I said, you come up to two different problems. And if I believe that Moses crossed the Yam Suf, or the Sea of Reeds, or the Nile River, which had the reeds, and crossed there and went into what we would call Sudan and Mali and over that area, and for 40 years, and then went down south. If I want to believe that, most people won't believe that, but that's where I believe. And if that is the case, then the animals of the Bible do fit. All the animals of the Bible can be found in Africa. Even the bears, there were bears in the Atlas Mountains many years ago. They're extinct, pretty much extinct now, or extinct now. But Africa has the animals. It has the crocodiles, it has the apes, it has the leopards, it has the lions and leopards, and all those things that are named, the peacocks. It has all the things that the Bible has. The ivory, the gold, the great rivers, the fountains of water, the great lakes, the great expanse of territory. And when you look at that, you go, okay, if that is true, then, as I said, Babylon would then have to have been in Africa. Because, as I said, it didn't make logical sense to me that Babylon could be in Mesopotamia, but yet the Bible says that Babylon attacked Judah and conquered them and took them slave. Then that doesn't make sense, because they didn't come down through Egypt. So then I have to go, okay, well then maybe, then you look at these old maps and you see, okay, it actually makes sense. If Cush, this is Cush's land, and Nimrod founded Babel, the Tower of Babel, and Nimrod was the son of Cush, who was the son of Ham, then that makes sense, that Babel and Babylon should be located in Cushite lands. Does it prove it? Absolutely not. I'm not going to say that it proves it. I don't want to. I'm not here to debate about it. Everybody will have their own opinion. Just for us to think, because just because we've been told one thing doesn't make it true. And just because 99% of scholars believe a certain thing doesn't make it true. I've done a video on Jerusalem. The scholars and archaeologists that have been digging up Jerusalem have found that at the time of King David and King Solomon, that there were 700 to 1,000 people living in what we call Jerusalem today. 700 to 1,000. Yet the Bible says that they had a 1.5 million man army, that Solomon himself had 1,000 wives and concubines and great palaces and temples, and they can't find them. They can't find the palaces. They can't find the ruins. All there is a humble village. So then the scholars of today, not all, but many scholars and archaeologists, believe that the Bible is just more myth than anything else. And yes, there may have been a chieftain in Jerusalem who over 1,000 people who was called David or Solomon, and they just later on made it into a great tale. Well, I don't actually believe that, not even slightly. But that's what the facts, the archaeological facts of what they dig, can only lead to a conclusion that the land shows in where we have Jerusalem today, that there are only 700 to 1,000 people living there. That's a fact by digging. They've dug up, and that's what they've found. The issue is, does that mean that the Bible actually happened there? We assume the Bible happened in a certain place. We assume that Mesopotamia is where Nimrod lived with the Tower of Babel. But we make assumptions based on what people have believed for whatever reason. But if we want to go back and look at coming out, fleeing Babylon, that means fleeing the histories that we've been given. It doesn't mean that all history, in my opinion, is wrong. But from what I'm looking at, a great deal of the history of this earth is hidden, and some people are into Tartaria and all these other things, but there's lots of stuff hidden that we don't know. Because whoever wins the wars, whoever conquers, writes the history. How do we get a very white, spanky white Jesus on all the pictures? Even if he was just from the Middle East of that day, he was not the white guy we have. I believe personally that he was likely African. I believe so. So he wouldn't have been even looking like what we call Middle East today. But even the people that live in Egypt today, who are mainly Arabs, 2.5, 3,000 years ago, they were blacks living there. It wasn't an Arab nation. It wasn't a white nation. It was a melanated people that lived there. King Tut and all these people, they were melanated, right? That's why they broke the noses off some of the statues. But be that as it may. But we do know that the land of Cush is assumed to be in where we call Ethiopia today, in Sudan, in that area. And Meroe would have been one of the capitals, or one of the main cities of the time. So to finish up, we assume that there was a figure connected to Cush, and his name was Nimrod. He was a mighty hunter. That's what the Bible tells us, and is what the Book of Jubilees tells us. Ancient maps also suggest alternative locations. It doesn't prove them, as I said, but it suggests alternative locations. And then we have a text, the Jubilees, okay, which describe the territorial boundaries and how sacrosanct these were, that they were not to go over them without being cursed. So individually, these things, they don't prove something, right? But if we take them as a pattern, they definitely raise a pattern. There's no doubt about it. And that pattern leads, to me at least, it leads to a question. Are we looking in the right place when we're looking for biblical lands? But especially in this video, when we're looking at Babylon and the Tower of Babel and Shinar, are we looking here in Africa, just below Egypt, in the fountains of the Nile River, or are we looking in Mesopotamia, which is the traditional view of today? I put this out there just for us to think about. But for me, I believe it was in Africa. That's what for me, my gut. But I have no proof. I've not gone and done archaeology, nor has anyone else done archaeology in those areas. How much archaeology has been done in Africa outside of Egypt, which had lots of archaeology, and the Middle East, especially in what we call the Levant or Palestine, or they call it the land of Israel today. That's had tons of archaeology. And the more they dig, the more it shows that the Bible could not have happened the way it happened in that land. It's too small, it's too arid, it doesn't have the animals, it doesn't have the people, it doesn't have the population, it doesn't have all the nations around it, it doesn't have what it needs. So if it isn't the land, maybe the Bible actually is accurate. Maybe the Bible is actually very accurate. And maybe there was a King David and a King Solomon, but they lived in Kenya or Uganda or Namibia or who knows where. But if they didn't, if we think that they lived in the Levant of today or the Israel of today, then we're kidding ourselves. Because the archaeology is showing there were no walls of Jericho, there was no Nazareth at the time of when Jesus was supposed to be there, right? There was no Capernaum as a big settlement, functioning settlement on the sea, what they call the Sea of Galilee. It wasn't there at the time when Jesus was supposed to have been there, right? Many villages and people they can't even find them. They can't find what is there. And the place just is too tiny, too small. So all I ask is that we think about it. I can't prove this. It's not my place to prove it anyway. I'm not a scholar. I'm just looking at the facts. I'm looking at what is the evidence and trying to come up with an alternative hypothesis, I suppose, where the Bible can actually be faithful as a text if we take it out of the anchor of the Levant or Palestine. If we say that, look, Rome made that land for whatever reason as a Hollywood script, in a sense, and they wanted a place to have a pilgrimage for the new Christians in the Roman, and they didn't want anything to do with the Hebrews, so they made a new land. Where was the old one? I don't know. My guess is probably in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, down that way. That would be my guess. But I do believe that the land of Cush is very important if we want to find where Babel was. And the strait that's named after it, the old maps that have Babel there and Babylon and these places, it's just something for us to think about. I hope you've really enjoyed this little journey to Babel. But I just want to mention that these two videos that I'm going to put here. One is on the Exodus, the real Exodus through the Nile River into North Africa and then down. If you want to take a look at, see if that makes any sense for you. At least it's an alternative route to take a look at. And the other one, if you want to know why Canaan was cursed, as we mentioned, and a bit more into that, why was he cursed, then that video is here. Anyway, have a good day and take care, and nice being with you. Take care. Bye-bye.